From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Today on Take on the South, we recognize and explore a fundamental truth about the South's past and present. And that truth is simply expressed. The South is also the history of civil rights. The story of the South cannot and should not be told without full recognition of this basic fact. And indeed, by not fully recognizing this braiding, we invite an ignorance that is both diluting and dangerous. To help us explore this important topic, we are joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Bobby Donaldson, a professor in the History Department at the University of South Carolina, and also director of the Center for Civil Rights History and Research at the university. Dr. Donaldson received his undergraduate degree in History and African American Studies from Wesleyan University and his PhD in American History from Emory University, where he served on the staff of the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project. Previously, he held the Thurgood Marshall Fellowship at Dartmouth College and the Susan Biddle Ford Fellowship at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Bobby, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
All right, Bobby, I'm going to begin with a comment and then a question, all right?
Okay.
And my comment is, I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate you for establishing what I think is really the jewel in the crown at the university. The Center for Civil Rights is powerful testimony to you and your staff, and you have my thanks for the kind of work that you're doing.
Thank you.
So bravo. My question, or my first question, I suppose, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what the center does, is can you share with our listeners, where you're from and some of the formative influences in your life when you were growing up, maybe, that led you to such a keen and abiding interest in the history of civil rights?
Well, we're in Columbia, and so I'm from down the road a piece in Augusta, Georgia. Mm-hmm. That's where I lived all my life until I went to college. I grew up in a household of historians who had no formal degrees and no formal training. My grandmother, who helped to rear me as a little boy, was a great storyteller. Yeah. And as a kid, I was nosy, precocious, listening to all these stories and the rhythm of the conversations, and they were the sort of the griots of a community. Mm. Another real impact for me was my grandmother's father, whose name was Smart Williams. That was his given name.
Is it really? I like that.
And Smart Williams was born in 1897 in Aiken County. He was a sharecropper who also was a veteran of World War I. Mm. And ultimately, he ended up maintaining a farm, but it was a farm that was inherited by his wife, my great-grandmother. Mm. Her people were landed. And so Granddaddy was able to maintain this property in Aiken County. It is in an area of Aiken County that is now called Petticoat Junction. That's the name of the community. And what's ironic is the family ended up living there, but originally they were from a place called Silverton, which was once at what is now the Savannah River site. Huh. So my mother's family were people who were living, thriving, worshiping, going to school in an area that we now call the bomb plant. Mm-hmm. And as a little kid, I remember people telling stories about churches being put on flatbed trucks and being moved down the road over to where we are now, schools being moved. And specifically, I remember vividly my great-grandfather saying he remembered graves being moved. Mm-hmm. And so that was almost a research assignment for me in middle school, trying to figure out, how did this story begin and where did people go? Mm-hmm. In Augusta, I went to a all-black elementary school. And in that elementary school, there was a woman named Mrs. Eason, who was she was assigned to be the school librarian, but she was like the history coach. She was a guidance counselor. And Miss Eason was the mentor to a group called the Library Club. And essentially the Library Club at this school was about history. And so our tasks were to populate the bulletin boards with Black history. So little Bobby Donaldson's assignment growing up was to go through Jet Magazine, Ebony Magazine, the local Black newspaper, and to take out clippings that would then be posted on the bulletin board. So that was my, entree into primary research.
Yeah.
Then what also stands out in those early years, in my 5th grade year, and this is now 1981, 1982, Miss Eason always wanted to expose us to cultural and social events. And I think it's 1981, the local Black college in Augusta, Payne College, which was a CME affiliated school, a Christian Methodist, once colored Methodist Episcopal school, had their centennial. And the speaker for the centennial was a man I had never heard of before. Later learned that he was the author of my father's college history textbook. And the title of the textbook was called From Slavery to Freedom. And the speaker was a man named Dr. John Hope Franklin. So here I am as a 5th grader in this church sanctuary listening to this guy who was powerful, persuasive, who was a PhD at that time at the University of Chicago teaching, who later moved to Duke. And so I'm listening to this guy, thinking I'm watching or listening to a preacher, not really knowing what a professor or a PhD is. And here I am now, that 5th grader who is now a college professor at the University of South Carolina. One last thing I should say that is also important in my own scholarly development. When I left that all-Black elementary school, I was a part of the integration movement in Augusta, in that we were part of a new initiative in Augusta called magnet schools. And the magnet schools were all thematic. There was a magnet school for science and health, and there was a magnet school for the fine arts. So I went to the magnet school for the fine arts, which was intentionally designed to be a way to integrate the public schools in downtown Augusta, Georgia. So I went to a place called the Davidson Fine Arts School, and one of my teachers asked us to consider being involved in this initiative called History Day. And I ended up doing that, and for my History Day assignment, I did a monologue. So I should press back again and say, at Davidson Fine Arts Magnet School, I'd gone in, I auditioned by playing the violin in 6th grade. But by 7th grade, somehow playing the violin was no longer cool in my own mind. So I gave it up and decided to major in drama. And so theater became my fine arts major from 6th grade to when I graduated. So for my History Day assignment, I performed my great-grandfather. I performed Smart Williams, and really spoke about what was life like, turn of the 20th century, for Black people, Black men in South Carolina. So I knew what he told me. I remembered what he had told me. But my history teacher said, well, you just can't rely simply on his accounts. You've got to verify, you need to substantiate. I'm like, well, what does that mean? So I finally figured out what that meant. So I was then sent to the library to figure out who might I consult who could corroborate, substantiate my great-grandfather's claims. So the one book I found was an African-American gentleman who was born around 1894 in a small community called Epworth, South Carolina. And this man's name was Benjamin Elijah Mays. And he published a book called Born to Rebel. And so I checked that book out of the Augusta Public Library all those years ago, and I now confess to everybody that I never turned the book back in. So in my office at the University of South Carolina is a first edition Born to Rebel book that I checked out of the Augusta Public Library over 40 years ago.
Well, you heard
And
it
I
first
still have
here.
it.
You've heard it first here. Bobby Donaldson confessing to book theft.
I still have it.
But there's a moral claim.
And I kept it in part because here is a black man who was born in similar circumstances to Smart Williams, very similar circumstances, but who ultimately got a PhD from the University of Chicago and became a college professor, who later became a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. and then president of Morehouse College. And so that book almost became a kind of a manual for me, even though we were, born generations apart. It still was quite instructive to me as I thought about, how do I become a John Hope Franklin?
Well, if anybody deserves to keep that book, you do. And I've known you for a long time, Bobby, and I learned a great deal in that conversation. The John Hope Franklin encounter, I can imagine how powerful that was, not because of his name, because you didn't know who he was, but through the sheer force of his intellect, right?
Yes.
And you're witnessing it up close.
Right.
Powerful.
And what I remember too, and I remember this well, here was a guy talking about American history. This is, again, it must have been the spring of '82. I remember him going in great detail to criticize at that time, the current administration for their failure to support higher education. And there was a ringing critique of the president of the United States, who was Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And I'm like, well, what professor is moving beyond their script on history to make a commentary about contemporary circumstances? And he was doing just that, unapologetically.
Yeah. And also an extraordinary scholar. I was teaching him just the other day, in fact. Just curious, have you ever been to Petticoat Junction?
I go through it all the time. I spent a lot of time there.
How big is it?
It's one corner, it's not. That's not their official name.
Okay.
It's really Aiken County in an area called Talitha, or some would say near an area called Jackson, and it assumed that name years later. But some of the same families have been there for generations. But for some who may be listening from South Carolina, probably the best point of reference is Silver Bluff High School.
Okay.
So it's not too far from the Hammonds of Silver Bluff.
Gotcha. Interesting. All right. No wonder you ended up doing what you're doing. It makes perfect sense now. You couldn't really be anything else.
No. And one other thing I'll say is, I'm almost at my 25th year at the University of South Carolina. Even though I'm from here, that was never my aspiration to be here. When I assumed, and you remember it well, when I joined the faculty, I thought I was passing through.
Oh, I know.
I thought I was here for a year, and here we are now, all these years later. And part of what I tell people has kept me here, in addition to the great colleagues and students, are these multiple projects, which I've been involved with over the last many years.
Well, I won't go into too much detail, but I remember distinctly a conversation that you and I had in Gambro Hall, and you had another job offer from a very prestigious school, a very elite school, very small school, and
my daughter's going there, by the way.
Well, that's poetic too, isn't it?
Yep.
And it wasn't just me that persuaded you, but I remember saying something to you. It's like, Bobby, the opportunity to impact your community here is going to be much greater than it is there, and it's been proven true. That's precisely what you've done.
That's correct.
Well, this leads us nicely then into the Center for Civil Rights and Research. And I mean, can you just, before we get into what it does, can you tell us a bit about its formation and how and why it came into being?
So I should say the Center for Civil Rights History and Research existed long before it was ever established. And the center officially was launched in the fall of 2015. Not long after the tragedies at Mother Emanuel. There have been conversations well before then, but that tragedy pushed the university to say we must do something to really capture the stories of civil rights in South Carolina. The center's emergence stemmed from a conversation with Congressman James Clyburn. The university libraries had been seeking to acquire his congressional papers, and he was not terribly sold on those papers coming to Columbia.
Do you know why?
Because he had already developed an archives in Orangeburg at South Carolina State University. Right. And there had not been much conversation with Clyburn about his papers being here. But ultimately, he said, I would consider if you can assure me that these papers will not simply go into a closet, that they will have some utility, and that the papers will be part of some sort of entity that would indeed advance scholarship and research around civil rights, that would support the teaching and instruction of civil rights history, but would also be utilized for public programming and community engagement. So that's when I received the phone call to join this conversation. I was not a part of it originally. I was already leading a faculty, a residential college at the university at the time. And so I was called on to provide some guidance, not fully knowing that it would become the center. And if I may go back a moment, I said that the center already existed. There were people on this campus doing the important work of documenting civil rights history and African American histories long before I came to the campus. And two that I want to make sure I reference explicitly. One is named Willie Hereford. And Willie Hereford was the original archivist of what is now the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta. He is one of the first trained African American archivists in the country. He once worked at the Harry Truman Library. And in the early 70s, Willie Hereford was brought to Columbia to be the director of African American Studies. He was the first director employed over 50 years ago, but many did not know he was trained as an archivist. And so through his teaching and his outreach, he had already been identifying individuals who were in the movement or earlier, and he had been acquiring collections. He had also been helping Allen University and Benedict College preserve their records. Not long after Hereford joined the faculty, he was joined by another incredibly talented young academic whose name was Grace Jordan McFadden. And throughout Grace's career at the university, she was building a civil rights center. She was working in the communities, she was engaging audiences, and she was building a first-rate oral history project, which to this day is still consulted. Another important person who was building a center well before the center itself was formed was a man named Tom Johnson. And Tom Johnson was the field archivist for the South Carolina Library. And so when I came to the University of South Carolina in 1999, already on our campus were the papers of Majeska Monteith Simpkins, the papers of Joseph A. Delane, the papers of John Henry McCrae, the papers of Nooker McCain. So all those papers were here, nicely preserved in archival boxes. And as a young teacher on campus, I was always using those materials, always engaged at the Caroliniana, making those records part of my course assignments. And so when the idea of a center emerged, it was not terribly difficult to pivot, because I knew all the elements and also knew many of the people who've been working. The other person I should mention who was really important in those early years was Dr. Valinda Littlefield. And Val Littlefield and I were hired at the same time with very similar interests. And she too had been working in the community, developing oral history projects, engaging audiences across the state. And so there were already in place the elements to develop a center. The other thing I'll say is, unlike other institutions, we did not have to go out searching and buying collections at that time. They were here. They just simply needed a platform to be amplified, to be made more readily available to the community. And in some ways, that's what the center has done, to elevate the work already done and to expand upon it.
You mentioned Grace McFadden. She was a professor of mine when I was a graduate student here. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Her work was absolutely important, and it still lives on. So can you give our listeners some sense of what the center does? I mean, it always impresses me, the sheer range of what you do, but can you give them a sense of not just the mission, which I think you've explained, but kind of the stuff that you do on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis?
I wish it were predictable. It evolves. I mean, we have done public programming in schools. I mean, regularly we have a team now. Now, before it was one or two people, and I was part of that one or two people out in communities, and then now we have a stronger infrastructure of staff who go out and train teachers, who train teachers about how to integrate our archival materials into the state standards. We have people who do walking tours now of civil rights in Main Street, of Columbia. We have another project called Justice for All, which is a traveling exhibit around the state of South Carolina. And over the past 2 years, the Justice for All exhibit has traveled from Sumter to Orangeburg, to Hartsville, to Spartanburg, to Beaufort, to Georgetown, and now back to Columbia, where it's now housed in the historic Booker T. Washington High School. And wherever that exhibit goes, there is professional development training for teachers. There are often oral histories collected. And also we work to identify new historical materials. I mean, we work to try to bring some of that material back to Columbia at our archives on campus, or we also work with museums and archivists across the state to at least make sure those items are flagged to be preserved within a local repository. Some other things we do is we have now a partnership with the National Park Service. And the National Park Service has committed several grants to the center. One of those grants now enables the university to renovate the historic Booker T. Washington High School. And there will be in that space a series of exhibits that will chronicle not only the history of civil rights, but it will also chronicle the history of the black neighborhoods that were adjacent to the Booker T. Washington High School. And so we anticipate over the next 3 or 4 years that auditorium building will be restored, and within that building you will not only see the history of Booker T. Washington High School, but you'll also see the history of the Ward 1 and Willow Hill neighborhoods. And these were two communities within a short walk of the university that have now been almost completely redeveloped for university purposes. So in that space, you will see that history. Another important initiative now is a project called Intersection. And the Intersection project, again, explores our archival collections and redevelops or sort of reconstructs the history of the historic Washington Street Business District of downtown Columbia. So presently at the Columbia Museum of Art, individuals go in and they can now see photographs, they can see newspaper articles, they can see artifacts from the Washington Street Business District. They can also see the photographs of a very accomplished photographer from the early 20th century whose name was Richard Samuel Roberts. And Richard Samuel Roberts was a photographer who worked in the 20s and 30s. He was a postal employee at night as a janitor, and a phenomenal photographer during the day on Washington Street. There is a book that was produced in the late 80s called A True Likeness, which is about 300 images of Richard Samuel Roberts. Many may not know that book stems from a collection of glass plate negatives, about 3,000 negatives of images that were taken in the 20s and 30s but were not rediscovered until the early 1970s. They were found or located in the crawl space of Mr. Roberts' family home near the governor's mansion. So right now, the Civil Rights Center at the University of South Carolina is working with our digital library to now digitize all 3,000 negatives. And that digitalization project is made possible through a grant from the National Park Service.
When you talk about going out and finding documents and evidence, are you always surprised about how much there is, how much you encounter? Yeah. Or is it hard to find?
No, I think the relationships and the networking is so critical. It's often been our default to say these records are long gone, they don't exist. I don't say that anymore.
Right.
Because nearly every day now we're reminded that, with the right knock on a door, the right conversation, you're beginning to discover that within people's personal collections, in churches, funeral homes, there's a tremendous amount of primary source material that will expand how we teach and tell and research the history of civil rights. A perfect example is at the intersection exhibit on Main Street at the CMA, Columbia Museum of Art. People come in all the time, and when they see a photograph, it jogs a memory. They're reminded that, wait a minute, I have this album, or there is this diploma. And so nearly every day there is this discovery that we sort of we try to track and to assist people with figuring out what to do. I mean, what do you do with these records? What do you do with this photo album? What do you do with these memories of what occurred 50 or 60 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen you speak on this stuff, and I have to say the level of forensic analysis, and you're kind of overlapping and coordinating and bringing together discrete pieces of information that seem discrete, and then to make the story whole is powerful testimony, I think, to what you're up to. And it really works, Bobby. And these footprints that you have established, they're generative and they're transformative, right? People, their memories are jogged.
Right. The other thing, too, I'll say is important, you know, until a university professor knocks on your door or a university graduate student, you don't always know that the story you've been telling or the document you have on your mantelpiece has value beyond your personal story. Right. So part of what I'm amazed daily or regularly when I meet people and they're sitting on what I would see as a historical gold mine, but for them it's simply a document or a photograph. And so that's why I think there's an urgency to it in what we do, that, you know, throughout this state, there are individuals who have materials that they may not even know has import beyond their own personal story. And so part of what I know happens regularly is that when we come on board, people are almost affirmed that there's a deeper, greater meaning about some of this material. There was one lady who had 2 or 3 original issues of a newspaper in Columbia called The Lighthouse and Informer. The Lighthouse and Informer was published in the 30s and 40s and 50s by a man named John Henry McCrae. The newspaper was published on Washington Street. These particular issues spoke about an African-American taxi cab driver and photographer whose name was George Elmore. And the lady did not know that story. She knew these papers may have meaning, but as you turn the pages of the newspaper, it tells the story about an African-American gentleman in Columbia who was bold enough to sue the all-white Democratic Party in the mid-1940s and was successful. So on one article or one issue, it tells that story of this man who files a lawsuit with the support of the NAACP against the all-white Democratic Party. But in another issue of that newspaper, it tells the story about the price he paid. It talks about the reprisals he experienced. It speaks about the family losing their home. It speaks about him losing his business. It speaks about his wife being committed to a mental institution. And so just those 3 articles completely reconstructs or reshapes how we talk about the civil rights movement in the post-World War II period. The lady who had those newspapers did not fully know that. And now we're able to tell her that this value does not simply have the obituary of your great-grandfather. It opens a window into how we research and teach the movement in South Carolina. And a movement, Mark, I should say, that when I joined the faculty, there were some well-meaning, seemingly well-informed people who were convinced that there was no real movement in South Carolina. There was nothing akin to Montgomery or Selma or Mississippi. And, you know, the records now check all that.
That's right. That's precisely right. And I do want to get into one specific thing, but let's piggyback on that really helpful observation. Isn't the history of the South utterly unintelligible without the story that you're telling? Well, it's intelligible, but it's simply inaccurate, right?
Yeah. It also is, who are you, like, who are you talking to?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that standard narrative is there was not much that happened here.
Right.
But who wrote those stories?
That's right.
What sources did they consult?
Mm-hmm.
Which institutions did they visit?
Yeah.
And again, without the intervention of a Grace Jordan McFadden, without the intervention of a Willie Hereford or Tom Johnson, those standard narratives remain uncontested, the scholarly narratives.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you went to other sources and other perspectives, it would completely reshape the received wisdom about our state and about the South.
I agree entirely. That's exactly right. Could you just satisfy my curiosity? I know something about this, but people will be interested in this. Could you say more about Columbia SC63,
Sure.
Our Story Matters, this documentary initiative you have?
So the Columbia 63 predates the Civil Rights Center. So a couple of the public history projects that I've been involved with that have really kept me engaged and excited about remaining in South Carolina. Early on, we worked on, and we meaning graduate and undergraduate students, projects to document Black neighborhoods. And one particular neighborhood was Ward 1, and that is a neighborhood that is now marked by the USC Coliseum, the Koger Center, the Colonial Arena, the Greek Village. Many may not know that was a historic, thriving, working class Black community. And so that was a public history project that I did over several years that is still ongoing. There is now a exhibit installed in the old Palmetto Compress building near Divine and Pulaski Streets. And in that now student housing complex, there is an exhibit that tells the history of this Black community. It talks about the schools and the churches and the businesses that were in that area that is now a high traffic area for our university.
Yeah.
We also worked on the restoration of historic Booker T. Washington Auditorium and helped to develop an exhibit that is there. Right thereafter, Columbia 63 was started. And Columbia 63 was initially a conversation with Mayor Steve Benjamin, who was the first African-American elected mayor of Columbia. And Mayor Benjamin had been in conversations with the mayors of Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham, Alabamas, Jackson, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee. And all of those cities were developing commemorative programs to speak about what occurred in their respective cities around the year of 1963. And Mayor Benjamin very much wanted to be involved with those conversations. The challenge was he and his team at that time did not know much about what was taking place in Columbia in 1963. One of the things we knew was that was the year that marked the integration, the second integration of the University of South Carolina. So he approached me to consider leading an initiative that would investigate what took place in Columbia in 1963. And we took that project on. That project led to an oral history initiative. It led to several exhibits in partnership with Experience Columbia and Historic Columbia. It led to an installation of wayside signs and historical markers down Main Street that tell the history of the movement. But perhaps more importantly, it led to a reconstruction, I believe, of the history of the movement in Columbia. And so in addition to commemorating the desegregation of the University of South Carolina, that project led to a series of programs around Martin Luther King Jr.'s presence in Columbia. It led to a program around the April 1963 visit to Columbia by an activist named Malcolm X, who visited Columbia, who was scheduled to speak at the Township Auditorium on April 17th of 1963, and the day before he was to speak, his contract was revoked once they discovered who was actually coming to speak at the auditorium. Someone provided us a ticket to Malcolm's speech, and we later found out that his event was moved to a small mosque near C.A. Johnson High School. And we've worked now to mark that mosque. Ironically, the day that Malcolm X was speaking in Columbia, Martin Luther King Jr. was in Birmingham in jail, where he penned the letter from the Birmingham jail. We also brought renewed attention to a case from 1954. So today, if you were to visit Columbia and you were to go to the corner of Main and Washington Streets, you would see a marker there honoring a young woman whose name was Sarah Mae Fleming. And in June of 1954, 1 month after the Brown v. Board, Briggs v. Elliott Supreme Court decision, this 20-year-old woman who was a domestic from Eastover, South Carolina, sits down on a bus, and she sits in a seat that was reserved for white passengers. She is accosted and beaten by the bus driver, and upon exiting the bus, Sarah Mae Fleming seeks counsel from a woman named Jessica Simpkins, who secures her a lawyer whose name was Philip Wittenberg. And Mr. Philip Wittenberg files a lawsuit against the bus driver and against the owners of the bus company, the owners of, which was S3E16. So there is a famous case called Fleming versus S3E16 that is cited in a case called Browder v. Gale. And Browder v. Gale was a court case that emerged from the Montgomery bus boycott that many associate with Rosa Parks. Well, Sarah Mae Fleming sits on a bus on June 22nd of 1954. Rosa Parks sits on a seat in a bus in Montgomery on December 1st, 1955, 17 months later. And so there has now been a great deal of work underscoring Sarah Mae Fleming's path-breaking role, but also trying to even clarify why we don't know.
Right.
Why do most American history textbooks always begin the movement with Brown v. Board and with Rosa Parks, and there is little or no reference to all the individuals and all of the organizations who predated what we call the classic civil rights movement?
Why don't we know?
I think it's partly how we write books, how we teach, to bookend the movement with Rosa Parks. Just it makes sense for some people because you lead right into Martin Luther King Jr. Rosa Parks's incident in Montgomery leads to MLK becoming the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association.
And it's Montgomery.
Right.
And it's not Columbia.
And the other important piece, and I'm believing this more and more, it was said to us in 2013 when the Columbia 6-3 started, and I believe it increasingly, that there was a deliberate, conscious effort in this city, and it was a collaboration between elected officials and the press to bury these stories, to minimize coverage. And Mark, we're in the process now of doing a series of documentaries with ETV, and there was a gentleman we spoke to who was a SLED agent in the mid-50s and later throughout the 60s. And he kept talking about incidents of civil rights protests, some incidents of racial violence. And as he's talking, my eyebrows are sort of rising. And I'm saying, sir, I've never heard of these events. And he looked at me and said, I know you haven't. And then he explained how Chief Strom, J.P. Strom, and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division wanted to minimize the coverage of certain events in this state. Now, Congressman James Clyburn and others have always said there was a blackout. They're right. And I think the stories of Sarah Mae Fleming and other incidents we can talk about, they never received press coverage because the press was instructed that these items either never be seen or that they be buried on the back pages. So, for example, when Columbia 63 was established, Mayor Benjamin worked with the publishers of the state newspaper to give us access to the morgue, the photographed morgue of the state newspaper. And we were told by some of the archivists there that, you're not going to find much. Well, once given access, we were able to find photographs of Martin Luther King Jr. in Columbia, photographs of Malcolm X at the Columbia airport in April of 1963, photographs of Medgar Evers in downtown Columbia, and it's endless. And now, fortunately, all of those photographs, which we were told we'd never find, have now been digitized by the Richland Library and are widely available to anyone for research purposes.
So I think your hunch is entirely right, and there's more than a hunch, but there's always been this comforting narrative about the genteel South Carolina accommodation experience, right?
Right.
So the integration here was always much smoother, not terribly violent, and there really wasn't much going on. I mean, that's the received larger narrative about integration and the civil rights in this state.
Right. And so when I was a young professor repeating those lines, I was quickly put in place that obviously, Professor Donaldson, you've not spoken to the black people who were the victims of these moments of violence and atrocity. And so I think, yes, there is far more work to be done to correct that narrative, in particular a narrative that says, the movement in South Carolina was moving according to plans until February the 8th of 1968, until the Orangeburg Massacre, until outside agitators like Cleveland Sellers, who, by the way, was from Denmark, come on the scene in Orangeburg and completely besmirch the reputation of South Carolina.
Right. Yeah, that's the narrative, isn't it?
Right.
What's coming up for the center? What have you got going on?
Well, we are currently with the National Park Service excited to develop some new initiatives. One of those will be a new postdoc program that will bring to our university leading scholars, and this will be a postdoc program and a visiting scholars program that will be in effect in the fall of 2025. Okay. And so we have members of our team now who are working on fleshing out the kind of duties and responsibilities of those roles and working closely with other academic units on campus. In the fall of 2025, in October of 2024, the Civil Rights Center of the National Park Service will be sponsoring a major civil rights history conference in Columbia, where we are seeking to bring in scholars of the civil rights movement, but also public historians, including those who work at several of the National Park Service sites, who such as the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta and the Brown v. Board National Park Service site in Topeka, Kansas. Those persons will be here, as well as activists of the movement. And so the idea is that you would have this major conference that would integrate scholars, public historians, and activists of the movement.
Right. Yeah, wow. If people want to engage, you have this fabulous website. Where would they go to engage with the center?
So for the center, it's civilrights.sc.edu. Okay. You can go there. There's also another site we have that's called justiceforallsc.org. And that is a digital exhibit that stems from an exhibit we once had on the University of South Carolina campus called Justice for All. And that exhibit was housed in the Ernest F. Hollings Library for 6 months. Then, after we turned the corner on COVID, it then traveled around the state of South Carolina. There's now a digital component of that narrates and illustrates a lot of the stories that I've mentioned in this conversation. There's also Columbia 63 website, and there you will see a lot of photographs of the movement that we're still waiting to identify. You will also see another important asset, which we're unique as a university to be able to archive. It's moving footage. And so there is actually moving footage of the demonstrations in Orangeburg, of the demonstrations in Rock Hill, the demonstrations in Charleston. There is moving footage of a major demonstration that took place in Columbia on March 2nd of 1961. It's only about 45 seconds, and you can see Reverend I.D. Quincy Newman, later one of the first African-American senator in the state of South Carolina since Reconstruction, he's marching around the State House, and you can see these individuals being arrested, and they go to jail. Their arrest and conviction lead to a landmark United States Supreme Court case called Edwards versus South Carolina, which is a key First Amendment case in the civil rights sort of legal history. Not many people knew who these people were. We've now chronicled every student who was arrested that day, and including a young James Clyburn. And there is now in downtown Columbia a monument that we erected to commemorate that demonstration, but also to recognize all those individuals who were a part of it. In the moving image material, there is footage of students in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Many may know that the students in Rock Hill in 1961 did something that was path-breaking. They decided not to accept bail. They decided they wanted to remain in prison to really dramatize the conditions. They were upset with the pattern. We would go to jail, be quickly bailed out, and we would go back to things as normal. Well, they said, let's come up with a new scheme. Let's stay in jail as long as we can to really dramatize the struggle, and they were successful. So the Jail No Bail campaign became adopted around the country. We have footage of those students. We also have footage of students from around the country who come to the York County Prison Farm, and that's where these men were being housed. And this footage was largely marked as Negro Demonstrators, Rock Hill, South Carolina, February of 1961. Well, if you were to go frame by frame in that moving image research, you would see this one young man whose head is cocked to the right. And when you press pause and you could look at it carefully, this unknown Negro student was named John Lewis. John Lewis has a very popular publication called March, a 3-volume illustrated account of his civil rights history. And in his 3-volume account, he says that his first time in South Carolina was in May of 1961. Well, that is when he came here as a freedom rider and where he was assaulted. And he always notes that Rock Hill was his first moment of violence in the movement. So John Lewis comes many, many years later to the University of South Carolina to receive an honorary degree. And when he's with us, I had to break the news to him that there was a mistake in his 3-volume series. And he looked at me sort of chagrined. He said, what would be the mistake? And I said, Congressman, you claim that your first time in South Carolina was in May of 61. He said, yes, that's when I was beaten. I said, well, you were here months earlier. And I show him the footage. He was shocked. He said he had no memory.
Well, I never.
In fact, when I showed him the footage, he's looking at it, he's like, my goodness, I had so much hair back then. That was his first response. Then he started naming the names of all the people standing next to him in this footage. And so when he told me, he said, we were everywhere all the time. And there were some things that just, I did not fully process. And we're discovering that with other people, that unless they see the footage or unless they see the photograph, there's nothing that triggers this memory. And so if anything, I think the work we're doing is providing the trigger and is enabling people to tell their story, but is also enabling us to capture those stories.
What an amazing multiplier effect too. I mean, it's creating a hell of a lot more work for you.
Right.
It would be remiss of me to not ask you about what you're doing in terms of your own scholarship. I realize that this is an awful lot of work and it is your scholarship.
Right.
But is there anything else you're working on?
All the time. And it's one of those challenges of multitasking and trying to, and I think we're at a point now where the center, which was a piece of paper on a desk and one person, a graduate student, now has 12 full-time people moving it forward. And it's now giving me time to pull back and let others move the center forward while I work on some other important scholarship. And 2 important, or 3 really, manuscripts that are before me. One is called In Our Own Defense, which is a study of black intellectuals in Georgia, early 20th century. And it looks at the path breakers of the civil rights movement in Georgia, in Atlanta, in Augusta, and Savannah, and the intellectual work they're doing to critique Jim Crow policy and segregation in the early 20th century. And many of those people become the teachers who helped to shape young Martin Luther King Jr. And others we know, young Julian Bond. The second project is a biography of a man whose name was William Jefferson White. And this project goes back to my childhood. I was from Augusta. I attended a church called Harmony Baptist Church. And Harmony Baptist Church was established in 1868 by a man named William Jefferson White. And William Jefferson White was also the principal founder of a place called Augusta Baptist Institute, which is now Morehouse College in Atlanta. Well, as a little kid, William J. White's portrait was on the walls of our church. This man looked like a white man to me, and I was just intrigued and confused as how this white man, in quotes, was the founder of Morehouse College. I later discovered that William J. White was mixed parentage, but who was through and through a race man. And so I'm now writing a biography on this guy who could have easily have passed as white, who could have easily crossed over to the other side, but did not. So this project seeks to explain why he did not. And another project I'm working on is a shorter biography of a man named Joseph H. Rainey, who in 1870 becomes the first African-American seated as a member of the House of Representatives in Congress. And this stemmed from an assignment I did with the Smithsonian Magazine. And they asked me to write a piece about Joseph Rainey's election. And that relatively small essay has now mushroomed to a much larger research project seeking to chronicle this man's career as an enslaved person in Georgetown, South Carolina, who later becomes free in Charleston, who leaves the country during the Civil War, comes back, serves as a key figure during the early years of Reconstruction, and then is elected to Congress, but who we know very little about beyond that.
That's right. Bobby Donaldson, my colleague, director of the Center for Civil Rights at the University of South Carolina, thank you for what you do, and thank you for being on Take on the South.
Thank you as well.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.